Hello, I'm Harley Schlanger from the Schiller Institute, and I'd like to welcome you to this week's webcast. It's November 15th, 2018, and as the dust is beginning to settle from the U.S. midterm elections, we're seeing an extraordinary and fascinating picture opening up, one of both opportunity and danger. I think we can start with what was a lost opportunity, the silly efforts of Macron to put his ego ahead of anything else at the Armistice celebration, the 100th anniversary of the Armistice ending World War I. Helga, this was an opportunity for Trump and Putin to speak, and Macron just seemed to brush that off for his own purposes. What are the deeper implications of what happened in Paris on November 11th?
Well, I think, it really shows what happens when vanity intervenes, because, obviously the commemoration of the end of World War I would have been a perfect opportunity. You had many, I think altogether 60 world leaders. You had the opportunity to really reflect on why did the First World War happen? How did it happen? Why was the world really sleepwalking into a great tragedy, which then, really ruined the entire 20th century because it led to World War II. So it would have been a perfect opportunity to think about that, to speak about that, and to, make real pledges that this should never ever happen again to humanity. So that opportunity was lost. Even the beginning preparations for a summit between Trump and Putin, which were underway, were nixed by Macron, who all of a sudden asked Russia and the United States not to distract from the big celebration and to basically not have their summit. So it was actually a very short discussion only between Putin and Trump. And, it was very clear, as some Russian commentators, in my view, correctly noted, that this was all theatrics to create a stage for Macron to deliver his big speech. Now, if you look at the policies coming from Macron, who is falling in the polls like a stone, it is quite remarkable, because he said that Europe should become more independent from the dollar. The euro, basically should be strengthened and be less dependent on the dollar. But he also called for a European army outside of NATO. And then his finance minister, Le Maire, a day or so afterwards, said Europe should be an empire, naturally a peaceful empire, but an empire to match the other empires like the United States and Russia and China. And Macron actually had said the European army is necessary to defend against Russia, China, and the United States. So, I mean, this is obviously quite something, and it reveals the backward old paradigm thinking of these people, which was unfortunately then backed a day or so later by Merkel in a speech to the European Parliament, also demanding sometimes in the future a real European army, when she contradicted herself a zillion times by saying it should be either inside NATO or within the context of NATO or as a supplement of NATO. But in any case, this idea that Europe must become an empire, or actually is an empire. I mean, this is not a new idea. This was already discussed by Robert Cooper, who I think still has some positions. He was the advisor to Lady Ashley when she was the foreign minister of the EU. And he basically already several years ago stated the EU is the largest empire ever, and it will increase and add new members without limits. So this is really a megalomania view. And if you look at the real condition of Europe, it shows you also that, it's an empire full of holes, like a Swiss cheese. One is that naturally after Theresa May announced that she had a deal worked out on the Brexit with the EU, that basically her government is now falling apart. It could actually fall, and you could have new elections, and we have to see how this shapes out. But that's not the only construction site, so to speak, in the EU. So I think it's really revealing, and I think this is really terrible. Empires have been the reason for World War I. It was not nation states. It was the Austrian-Hungarian Empire, the German Empire, the Russian Empire, the British Empire, and empires, and especially now, if you build up Europe as an empire against Russia and China and the United States, this is exactly the kind of old thinking what must be overcome, and this is why I said that the most urgent question is to overcome geopolitical thinking in blocks, and that we must move very rapidly to a new paradigm which starts with the one humanity and goes for common aims of mankind, and not that kind of backward-oriented kind of thinking as expressed by Macron and Merkel.
It's quite ironic in that sense that in Macron's attack on nationalism, what's he putting forward as an alternative, an empire. And as you pointed out, empires, especially the British Empire, have been the biggest cause for wars in the last 2 centuries. Now, in talking about the collapse of Europe, you mentioned Brexit, but we're seeing all these forces moving in different directions. Let's take the case of Italy, where there have been continuing developments where the EU is trying to force Italy to adhere to policies which haven't worked and won't work. And there continues to be a reaction to that.
Well, I think the present Italian government, Finance Minister Tria and Undersecretary of Commerce Michele Geraci were very firm in saying that they will not capitulate to EU pressure, that the idea of the EU Commission that Italy should reduce its budget deficit to only 0.8% would be economic suicide. Even the Maastricht rules say that the budget deficit should not be more than 3%. So what the Italian government actually proposed was a 2.4% increase in the deficit. So they're below the Maastricht criteria, and obviously this is an obsession by the EU, which the Italians absolutely correctly reject. And when an interviewer from BBC asked Geraci, why are you not behaving as well as the Greek and the Spanish and the Irish who did follow the EU austerity prescriptions? He said, well, they were suffering, and Italy does not want to continue the mistakes and suffering of these countries, and this is why we need an investment program and we need economic growth and not this kind of austerity. So, there is right now a big debate in the European Central Bank, in the European Commission and other places, what should the EU do? Because if they escalate the hard line against Italy, they may actually trigger Italy to eventually have no other choice than to leave the euro and possibly, even the European Union if this whole thing is falling apart. On the other side, if the EU capitulates and lets the Italians do as they propose, then naturally their iron fist is weakened, and other countries in Europe say, okay, when the Italians can go for growth, so can we. So they are really in a dilemma, and it just underscores between the whole situation with the Brexit, the British crisis, the Italian EU quarrel, that this EU has no unity and it has no solidarity either. So this is a very dramatic situation.
And you see Macron and Merkel sort of leaning on each other the way 2 drunks do to stand up. What's the situation in Germany? There's a selection process underway for the new CDU leader, the Christian Democratic Party leader. There's all kinds of speculation about Merkel. And there's an emergence of an extremely dangerous tendency around the Greens of people who are rejecting Merkel and saying the CDU should align with the Greens. This is certainly not a good development, is it?
No, Friedrich Merz, who has been out of politics for, I don't know, 15 years or so, working for all kinds of firms, recently for BlackRock. He was the European CEO or presidium spokesman for BlackRock. He's the head of the Atlantic Bridge. With other words, he has a completely neocon, neoliberal profile. And, he has not said anything which would cause you to think that he has any new ideas for the real economy. Now, in the past, he was against the Greens, but now he says, oh no, the Greens have changed. They are now such a bourgeois party. They are so liberal, and he can imagine to enter a coalition with the Greens once he would be CDU chairman and possibly chancellor. Now that would be a catastrophe because, the fact that Germany already exited nuclear energy and that the green policy is this escalation to also go out of coal, to go for the decarbonization of the world economy they would like. But for Germany, if you only go to such energy sources with low energy flux density like wind and solar, then naturally, a highly industrialized country like Germany would just not be functioning. Already now, the energy prices have gone through the ceiling. And, the CDU Green coalition with some FDP possibly added, this is really terrible. It goes completely against the interest of Germany, and the Greens are on a rabid anti-Russia, anti-China profile. I have not heard from Merz himself what his policies are on Russia and China or the new Silk Road. But, this green element is really a disaster. And so, I think, the only good thing I can say is that many other countries in Europe are absolutely pursuing cooperation with China. They want to be part of the new Silk Road. And even some states of Germany, like Schleswig-Holstein, the most northern state, and also, I think, Mecklenburg-Vorpommern, and also Bavaria are absolutely for cooperation with the new Silk Road. So I think this remains a big fight, and a lot depends really on the momentum to organize for a new paradigm, and that is clearly left to the Schiller Institute. At least in Germany, we are the only force really fighting for this kind of cooperation with the new Silk Road.
And while we have this dangerous attachment to imperial geopolitics from old Europe, you might say, the very promising diplomatic initiatives, economic initiatives continue to come forward from the East. There's an ASEAN summit, an East Asia summit that just took place, and the discussion between the U.S. and China appears to be back on track after a bit of a detour. What can you tell us about these developments?
Well, the ASEAN and APEC meetings in Singapore, basically all the leaders from Asia went from the Paris summit or the Paris celebrations to these summits. And obviously they had many, many bilateral meetings on all Asian issues. The basic focus was, to continue to work towards a multipolar world. They made a new fair trade agreement among all Asian countries, which is quite different than the TTIP approach of Obama was before. They agreed on a code of conduct for the South China Sea, namely that all conflicts will be solved through dialogue and diplomacy and not any other way, not any unilateral suits or leave alone military options. So this is very good. And I think that, there were discussions, for example, between Putin and Prime Minister Abe from Japan, that they will resume their negotiations on a peace treaty between these two countries, which obviously would be very, very important. And obviously the Korea situation was a strong issue. So I think, this is all moving in a quite different direction, and it just proves that the real dynamic is in Asia. Now, obviously, we are now only very few, less than 2 weeks or so away from the G20 summit. And I think that the opportunity which will be given through the summit of Trump and Xi Jinping, and Trump and Putin on the sidelines of the G20 meeting in Buenos Aires, that this is a focus. I mean, I do not expect the G20 as such to come out with some grandiose plan, because, you have many different elements in it. But I think, the increased weight of the Asians within the G20, should also, tend to make that institution a more important one. But what we from the Schiller Institute have basically said is that, given the fact that the danger of a financial collapse is absolutely still present, the latest figures are that every day you have $5 trillion worth of assets floating around the globe, and only 2% of these 5 trillion pertain to physical economy. 98% are purely speculative and monetarist. And if you remember, already in 98, President Clinton at the time had warned of these global financial streams, saying that this represents a mortal danger. And he had demanded a new financial architecture at that point, which probably was what triggered the Levinsky affair. So in the meantime, it has grown into 5 trillion. And, this is the Damocles sword which is hanging over us. So a new financial architecture would really be the subject for the G20. But, we are pushing that at least the presidents of the United States, of Russia, China, and India, and possibly Japan, that they should put a new Bretton Woods credit system on the agenda, because this would be actually the forum which could decide that. Now, a new Bretton Woods credit agreement would really remove the danger of a financial collapse, and it would provide the kind of cooperation among nations to address actually all the problems: financial crash, the lack of development, poverty, reconstruction, refugee crisis. All of these things could be addressed. So we are in a mobilization from the Schiller Institute, and I invite you, our viewers, to join us and help us to get this kind of a discussion for a new kind of financial, or rather credit system, on the agenda before it is too late.
Well, I think an important step toward that direction was the shift we saw coming from two of the president's spokesmen on the negotiations with China. Kudlow, who's the chief of the Council of Economic Advisors, and Commerce Secretary Wilbur Ross said at a conference that they're very hopeful that the talks with China and the United States can get back on track. And this is something that the President Trump has talked about, the importance of his great chemistry with Xi Jinping. But at the same time this announcement came out, you have an escalation again from the neoconservatives in the Congress, led by little Marco Rubio, the senator from Florida and Wall Street. Rubio and others put out these reports, which essentially are very similar to what we're seeing from the European Union. China is a dangerous threat, a predator, and we have to be prepared to stop them. I mean, this is exactly what you're talking about. And when, Helga, you're talking about sleepwalking into war, isn't it?
Oh, yes. I mean, I have said this in the past, but I want to just state this again. Nothing in the policy, in actually history of China, but especially policy of the last 40 years, would give any credibility to the aggressive nature of Chinese intentions. Absolutely to the contrary. And that is why an increasing chorus of countries from Latin America, from Asia, even from Europe, from Africa, praise the kind of win-win cooperation they have as a result of the Chinese Belt and Road Initiative. And it is just not true. I mean, it's just a lie which is peddled because some of these, geopolitically thinking people want to keep to their privileges, and they think that that requires to keep China down. Now, if you want to have World War III, then that may be possible, but nobody will survive such a war. I want people to think about it. You know, the United States has 325 million people. China presently has almost 1.4 billion people, and that was a subject at the recent China International Import Expo in Shanghai. They have presently already a relatively wealthy middle class of 300 million people, and they want to have 600 million middle class people in 10 years from now. This is an enormous market, and obviously it will not stop there, but the tendency will be to just make China a all-around prosperous country. That has been the policy outlined by President Xi Jinping at the 19th National Congress of the CPC in October last year, that they want to have by 2050 China to be a fully developed, modern, industrialized, democratic, harmonious, culturally progressive country, which means they will have long overcome poverty, and they will probably have 1.5 or more billion people who will be in the middle class. Now, China is absolutely putting the emphasis on innovation, and as some people who have been working in China and know the situation have noted, it is just not true that China is copying Western technology, and that is what they depend on. China, in the meantime, has bypassed the West because of their focus on innovation in several fields already. One of them, most obvious, is the fast train system, which is an excellent development, which is not matched by anything in the West, and this is entirely Chinese engineers. So I could add their being the most advanced in fusion research, their very ambitious space program, their absolute focus on the excellence of their students. So the idea that you can suppress a country which has a 5,000-year-old history, which has been the leading force at least until the 15th century, and then periodically also after that, and now is on this course, and it has the largest population. Maybe it's going to be bypassed by India at some point, but it's just an extremely large population. The idea that you can suppress such a country and stop it from developing, is just ludicrous and really reflects the wrong thinking. What China has offered is a great power relation of a win-win cooperation among large nations or great nations, and that is what they want. They don't want to bypass the United States as the dominant power. They have stated very many times this is not the intention of China. They just want to have respect for the sovereignty and non-interference, acceptance of the other social system. But if you relate positive to China's offers, it is a benefit for everybody. So the idea of this absolute lying China bashing, which has taken a new degree of aggressiveness with these reports coming from various study groups and commissions. You mentioned Rubio. I mean, that just is really counterproductive, and it confuses the population, who all of a sudden think China is the big threat, and it is not. And I really want to emphasize this, that this China bashing is really a lie. It's a complete invented narrative to cover for the geopolitical intentions of those who spread it.
Now, Helga, speaking about win-win, we can get a little controversial here for a second. We have an opportunity to replace the partisan polarization in the United States, typified by people like Adam Schiff and Maxine Waters and others who are saying that the midterms are all about impeaching the president, or the possibility of cooperation on national interests, particularly on infrastructure, credit policy. Are we moving in that potential in the United States, and how do you see that unfolding?
Well, I think, following the election, it is very clear that the Democratic Party has two completely different tracks. You have the absolutely hysterical, Obama-Hillary tradition, which is expressed by such people as Nadler and Adam Schiff, who are pushed by the Wall Street, who are pushed by the Washington Post and the New York Times, who basically say that the key task of the Democrats right now is to protect the Mueller investigation, the so-called Russiagate, to protect the FBI, to protect the Department of Justice. Basically, the Russiagate has long been proven to be British Gate, to be the collusion between the Obama administration, the intelligence heads, and the British government to make a coup against first the presidential candidate, Trump, and then an elected American president. And that investigation is still ongoing, and one can only hope that President Trump sooner or later, better sooner, declassifies all the documents pertaining to Christopher Steele, to all the Department of Justice officials and FBI and CIA officials who were in collusion with the British on this coup. So therefore, it is quite ludicrous for these Democrats to basically say that this is the most important. Now, fortunately, our own reading is that even in the Democratic Party, people who don't like Trump, that they are sick and tired of the continuous bickering and basically putting this scandal mongering up. And they want that indeed yet now is the time to focus on the real economy. So Nancy Pelosi, who is representing the second faction, she actually indicated that she would be willing to cooperate with Trump on a bipartisan level for infrastructure and other urgent questions. Naturally, there is a big rebellion against her in the Democratic Party. But I think, the chances that, reason prevails and that, basically the Mueller operation is really being shut down and discredited as part of this British coup, I think that chance absolutely exists. And, one should just note that just today, the paper or the online paper Daily Caller reported that Roger Stone, who is a key focus of the Mueller investigation, his lawyer was able to prove that Stone was speaking the truth in front of the House Intelligence Committee last year when he said that he did not speak to Julian Assange from WikiLeaks to get the information about the upcoming leaking of Wikipedia of the Podesta emails, but that his source was this guy, Predico, who then subsequently denied that in a grand jury. So the lawyer of Stone was able to basically get an old phone, which Stone stopped using after 2016, and the messages between Credico and Stone were reconstructed, and it's very clear that he was the source for Stone. So that should help Stone's situation greatly. And this is the case with all the other investigations. And the sooner this is all made public, the better.
Helga, to conclude, you founded the Schiller Institute in large part because of your sense that the only way to get out of the mudslinging and toxicity of this kind of politics is to uplift the image of man and to make this a central theme in any political activity or organizing activity. This was brought into the U.S. campaign by Keisha Rogers with her discussion of the importance of developing the creative potential of every child. I think it's important, given what we're seeing with the opportunities now, the potential, but also the dangers, to just reiterate this whole point as to why you created the Schiller Institute.
Well, let me just add something I should have said before, concerning the debate. Should you go in the direction of continuous hysterical attacks on Trump, or should you have a bipartisan or better above party cooperation? I mean, one urgent reason is really, the unprecedented fire in California, where, it's now very clear, that the green policies of, not allowing water management, not allowing investment in infrastructure, has created, since the times of Enron, in the 80s, the kinds of conditions which makes these wildfires so dangerous. So, this is the moment where the United States needs to go to a reconstruction, and it can only be done together with Trump, and this bickering absolutely must stop. Anyway, I just wanted to mention that because, not to think of this unfolding drama where more than 50 people have died and many more are missing. I thought I should just mention that. But in answer to your question, I mean, the United States and Europe, in a similar way, even the predicates may be different. We have a deep moral crisis. I mean, the violence, the mass shootings, the drug addiction epidemic, the suicides, the violence in the schools, which especially in Germany is becoming a huge issue. All of this reflects that we have moved away from our best traditions in our cultures when our cultures were great. This, for the United States, was for sure the spirit of the founding fathers, the period of Lincoln, and naturally then FDR and Kennedy to a certain extent. And in Europe also, we have moved away from the great humanistic traditions of the classical culture of the Italian Renaissance, the Andalusian Renaissance in Spain, the German classics. And we have allowed that the most degenerate kind of cultures, everything is allowed, everything goes. The liberal idea, that you can do whatever you want. There is no more binding morality, no more binding cultural values, but whatever you please to do, it's fine. This, together with the perversion of pornography, the violence in the entertainment, in the movies, in the video games, this has had such a devastating impact on many generations that we need urgently to move back to the idea of classical culture, that we need to have beauty in our lives. We need to purify and ennoble our character and mind and soul through our own aesthetical education, which we can only get from great music, from Bach, from Beethoven, from Dvorak, from others, from great poetry, from beauty in all classical forms of art. And so this is the second most important focus of the Schiller Institute. We want to have a new world economic order which allows the economic development of every nation on this planet, which exists through the powerful dynamic of the new Silk Road. But it has been my view from the beginning of the Schiller Institute in '84 that this all would not work if it was not combined with a classical renaissance of classical culture. So since the Schiller Institute is engaged in many such activities, concerts, poetry readings, and similar things, I want you to join the Schiller Institute if you agree that we need a new paradigm in thinking. and contact us, become a member, and work with us, because now is the time to change history to the better. Objectively, the possibility exists, but again, it will be the subjective factor. Are there enough people who get on board and get active? So contact us and work with us.
Okay, Helga, I think that was pretty clear. See you again next week.
Okay, till next week.